Just coming in remotely. Hi, good. Okay, you're ahead of me again.
Are we good to go?
First level.
I like the suggestion from Freedom. They said it's going to show the screen of the computer instead of just the big screen when you show the camera because it's so bad.
Yes, yes. So
but you don't see the.
No,
yeah. I can put that on.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to see you all. We have to fill this out again.
Yes, we do. We have to choose the menu.
Yeah, a housekeeping issue to start off. You'll notice you all have this long form in front of you again. If you could just circle which entree you'd like for lunch, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. We'll pick those up.
The main plate.
So it was such a pleasure to talk with all of you yesterday. I think that we had an opportunity to talk about a wide range of issues and, in fact, perhaps scope the project a bit more and understand, especially from the different countries represented, where some of our commonalities lay and where some of the major differences are. And this morning, we'd like to briefly hear from you, do a tour of the table of what some of the key messages that you took away from day one were. And that gives an opportunity also for us to provide a recap to Ngai Warren Mundine, who's joining us from all the way from Australia, who had a bit of trouble getting here. So thank you so much. And he's representing Indigenous leadership in Australia. So thank you so much for coming all this way. So if we could do a recap to the top of your main takeaway, as brief as possible from our conversations on the first day, and introduce yourself as well. That'd be wonderful. Which we start over here with on the left.
Certainly, I haven't really collected my thoughts. I didn't realize that, but I guess I could start with some points. For sure, I know that one of the things that we talked about, a takeaway, is that when we look at engaging Indigenous people in regional development, that we also have to make sure that if a community, after being given all the information and doing a full assessment of the types of developments that are being proposed, as long as they're able to have the support to make an educated decision, an informed decision, that if they still say no to development, that should be respected. That as stewards of the land, Indigenous people, they should be compensated for being stewards of the land and protections of some of the most valuable natural resources on this earth. So that needs to be considered. That we look at leading examples of where collectives have come together to put together leading practices, whether it comes to natural resource development, whether it be forestry, mining, fisheries, those types of developments, that we look at providing a place or institutions that could be supportive of Indigenous people, so that they could have information, technical data assessed for them, and have a place to go for technical expertise to assist them in making an informed decision. We also talked about the world needing a reconciliation action plan. I think reconciliation is an important component to all the work that's being done with Indigenous people today, and that we should have a concerted effort to look at ways to promote reconciliation, meaningful reconciliation. And that's an important concept that we also talked about. We talked about how there's a real need to look at ways to gather statistics and data. And we talked about in Canada how we used to have a First Nations Statistical Institute, but maybe we need to revisit that and look at how that type of institution could be developed to collect the kind of data, because we all feel as Indigenous people that we're studied to death. And that if there was a way that we could have all of our information feed into our own institute to collect that data, I think that would be so important. And we all gave advice to our respective governments and what we would like to see. There were, I know in my case, I encouraged the further development and recognition of the Indigenous nations and supports of our traditional governments. I also talked about legislating the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I also talked about taking meaningful steps to implement the recommendations of our Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, or calls to action. So that's all I can recall right now, and I'm sure we can add to it as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. And just because you didn't say your name, for anyone who's joining us online, that's Dawn Beach, and she's our Indigenous champion for Canada for this project. Thanks so much, Dawn. Marie-Chantal, if you could, and I'll ask, sorry, to keep your remarks brief because we unfortunately don't have too much time.
I won't have remarks at this stage, thank you, but I'll just introduce myself for a new colleague that has joined us from Australia. And for people online, I'm Marie-Chantal Girard, and he is Assistant Deputy Minister, Policy and Communication at Canada Economic Development for Quebec Region. It's a pleasure to have all of you here, but I'm also the chair of the Regional and Development Policy Committee of the OECD. Under their leadership, we're doing this study. So welcome, and I'll leave it to them for that.
Good morning. I'm Christopher Duchan, Director General of Economic Development Policy, Department of Indigenous Affairs, Government of Canada. My main takeaway yesterday is that we ate a lot. Not really a policy issue, that's just it. No, there were a couple of things that, despite the diversity around the room, some of the fundamental issues are the same about community economic development. But I guess my main takeaway is that I don't think we would have had this conversation or not in this spirit 10 years ago. And although there are a lot of challenges still, I think certainly from a Canadian perspective that the climate is much more optimistic than it would have been a decade ago. And I heard some of that echoed from the other countries. Perhaps I need to be better informed about that. But I think the tone of this discussion is very more promising than it would have been a decade ago.
Hi, Neil Burnett, Director of Policy Research, working for Christopher as well, just to add his sentiments as well in terms of the opportunity that Canada has right now, and the assets that need to be could be unleashed in supporting communities and their economic development aspirations, however they define them. I think is exciting for us. In terms of the conversation yesterday, I like sort of the theme about the land and the jurisdiction and over the land. I really think that that's going to be an important aspect of the study going forward that I'm really looking forward to getting into. Thanks.
Hi, Frederick Esau from Quebec Region INAC, Economic Development Manager. Same for my fellows here. It's good to, because being a regional employee, it's good to have the national experience and to learn about the international experience because we see lots of similitudes. And looking forward to see how you address those framework afterward because it all seems to be kind of ground to build for these things.
Buenos días, para el Departamento Nacional de Planeación. Digamos, complementando lo que han dicho mis compañeros y reforzándolo en términos de reconocimiento de derechos que tienen Colombia para con los pueblos indígenas. En términos de su territorio se reconoce la autonomía y la libre determinación, aspectos que son digamos, fundamentales a la hora de pensar en vinculación al desarrollo, en tanto ellos les cabe el derecho a plantear su propio desarrollo dentro de ese territorio. Y es un aspecto que no se debe desconocer. Se mencionaron como recursos potenciales para vincularse al desarrollo no solo la tierra, sino también el capital cultural y los recursos ambientales que hay en esos territorios. Y frente a la información estadística, mencionamos la necesidad de no solo hacer visible la dimensión étnica dentro de ella, sino también a la escala que son necesarias no solo para el país, sino para los niños, para las comunidades indígenas poder generar sus procesos de desarrollo y la pertenencia que ven en esas variables. Gracias.
Yo.
Muy buenos días. Mi nombre es Liliana Narváez, soy líder indígena de mi comunidad. Es muy felices sentirse estar aquí, recibir enseñanzas de ustedes. Estos procesos que se llevan, Dios mediante sea un mayor apoyo para las comunidades indígenas del país que es Colombia, donde pertenecemos nosotros, que la verdad nosotros sí lo necesitamos para nuestro beneficio, para nuestro buen vivir de ahora y de nuestro futuro. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días para todos los presentes. Vengo de la delegación de Colombia. Venimos con el propósito de aprender cuando se trata en materia de economía indígena. Para nuestro caso especial, mirar de que las experiencias compartidas en todo el país es la misma causa que los pueblos indígenas. Tratamos de resolvernos en una escala de nivel de condiciones, en la cual las enseñanzas que ayer tocamos tienen que ver mucho paralelamente con las proyecciones que tenemos los pueblos indígenas a nivel de cada país, con la cual queremos superar y mejorar condiciones humanas para la relación del hombre y la naturaleza y el cuidado del mundo. Muchas gracias.
Good morning. My name is Stefan Mikkelson, and I'm newly elected chair to the Livelihood Committee of Southern Parliament on the Swedish side. We walk to the future in the footprints of our ancestors, and if you destroy the footprints, you will also destroy our future. Today, the pasture for the reindeers are a protected right in Sweden, and if anyone destroys the pasture for the reindeers, they have to or should be under the penalty of the law. Unfortunately, that does not happen in all cases, but still, the law is there, and it shows that indigenous peoples and indigenous culture have a right, have a legal right, also seen in the context of development of international human rights instrument. And there is not a coincidental that we are standing here, sitting here today, and I'm very grateful that OECD has taken the measures and steps to make an improvement in the windy world. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Emmanuel Bertrand-Gouvain. I'm here for the First Nation Economic Development Commission. briefly, First Nation are involved in economic development, but for sure they would like to get more and more involved. And for that, at the regional level, there's some opportunities. Not easy to join First Nation and the other participants at the regional level, but there's a will to do so. Regarding that data issue, First Nation organization have a lot of reliable data, and for sure there's some way to collaborate on that issue. And also I joined my voice to Don, who recap perfectly what we learned from yesterday.
Good morning. My name is Flavia Napolich from Peru, from the Vice Ministry of Agricultural Affairs. I would like just to add briefly how surprised I am that we have so many similarities besides the difference between the countries and development, particularly regarding data, and also the importance that I have just simply stressed regarding the traditional knowledge and intellectual property rights for economic indigenous peoples development.
Good morning. I'm Jim by Warren Mundine. I come from the Australian Indigenous Chamber of Commerce, and we've been pushing this idea of economic development for a number of years. It really started back in the early 90s, 2000, about this idea of what is missing in regard to our Indigenous policies in Australia. We have this policy called Closing the Gap. Closing the Gap looks at health, education, and a wide range of things, but the gap hasn't been closing actually over the last 10 years of reporting. And so, in fact, this year, in February this year, it actually showed we're going backwards in a number of areas. I've always argued that the biggest missing link in that is economic development, the approach of economic development. And so since 2004, governments have been picking up on this and slowly working towards it. And then, of course, in 2014, the government really started pushing ahead with this idea of economic development, going to regional and remote Australia in regard to small and medium enterprise developments, and also in our larger urban areas as well. I always work from the base of that at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day, the sunrise, Indigenous people have the rights to say yes or no, and the power to say yes or no to whatever their development is. And I agree with you, Dawn, in regard to provide support, provide information, but at the end of the day, it's their country and they will make those decisions. Thank you.
Could you briefly introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Michelle Kenny from Canada Economic Development for Quebec Regions. I work at the Policy and Programs Department, and I just would say briefly that what I retained from yesterday's discussion, it's when you are looking for economic development solutions for Indigenous communities, you need to involve the Indigenous community from the beginning. You need to build on their assets and their knowledge. And even if there are a lot of similarities among the countries, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So it will be really interesting to see what kind of solution we will have as the OECD purchased the place-based approach. So it will be really an interesting report that we will have at the end. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Patrick Watson. I'm manager in Neil's team. That's Policy, Research, and Legislative Initiatives at Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada.
Yes, I'm Serge Rossier. I'm working at the Canada Economic Development for the Quebec region, and I'm a senior policy. Is that it? Oh, something like that. And, I'm taking care of the WebEx and some of the technical issues.
Good morning, my name is Oli Marner. I'm the elder from Wendake. I'm very happy to be here with you. I wasn't here yesterday for the whole day, so I can really say anything about yesterday, except that the first step that we want that succeed at was tourism. And that goes back to 150 years ago when we made canoes and snowshoes. And people would come around and visit our Indian reserve and come and see how people work. That was the first step. And we realized that after some years and after the war, things changed since we had kids going to school, but we came back to tourism as our way of feeding our families. And it's the best way because we do it at our speed and the way we want to do. We're not obliged to do anything that we don't want to do. Thank you very much.
And I wanted to ask, I understand there are people joining us online. Serge, could you tell us
who's online?
Yeah.
We have Fiona Hartford from I think the European Commission, and we are also Patrick. Yes, he's online on WebEx, and we have also a colleague from FedDev, Kathy Cadret. She's over the phone.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for providing us that great overview for day one. As usual, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Tamara Fratchukov. This is my colleague Chris, and joined with Diana as well. We're all from the OECD. And if I could offer my brief reflections on the first day. The first is that our discourse uses the term economic development, but we frame that within a well-read approach. And it's important for us to communicate that because we are talking about broader concepts. And the second one is that what we heard yesterday was described very often small communities dealing with extremely complex issues, and that knowledge really is power, and the importance of having communities have the right knowledge to make the right informed decisions, and that's a real challenge. And it's, as data nerds, it's something that particularly interests me, and how we can help them have that and help understand and enrich those understandings. And now over to you, Chris. We'd like to hear what we're focusing on today.
Okay. Presentation will come up. So I just wanted to just give based on our reflection as a team, what our recap was of day one, and then also what the expectations are for today as well. So I just took what Dawn was saying about the circle, and just to say that we began building that circle. We cooked some bread yesterday. The Colombians won the cooking contest. Mine wasn't that good, but it was still edible. So, and that was a great experience. I think it's very important that we build those relationships as part of this project. So, just in terms of again our view on day one, what we talked about was the OECD approach to regional development, and our view is that national governments cannot just think about their country as one size fits all. You cannot just think about big cities. You need to think about all the different territories across your country, that each of them have different growth dynamics, and policies need to be adapted to different places. So different places in cities, in rural areas, in areas which are remote, and governments do not have all the information about what is going on in different places. So it means that governments need to work with local communities on development in a bottom-up way to focus on what their assets are, and then to help them facilitate and enable their development vision. We think that this is a good approach for thinking about Indigenous economic development. We had a discussion with Indigenous leaders around the table, and those themes came up in the discussion just then about informed decision making, not just focusing on gaps and deficits, but recognising that Indigenous communities have unique talents and assets that can create business opportunities in areas like tourism and renewable energy. The data theme was strongly came up because data is an important precondition for being involved in the development process, about understanding what your assets are, about making good decisions about projects. We also talked about the important role of women in economic development, Indigenous economic development. And we also had a discussion about good practice, about different projects from across countries, and there are a couple of themes which came up in relation to that. One is about having a vision which is developed by the community, which is based on a considered view of their assets and their opportunities in different markets. Having, given that often community capacity is not strong, having government there to provide financial and technical support in terms of developing those strategies and selecting projects. And then, as I said, it's also dependent on government itself being flexible, working with communities and being able to adapt the way government works to the different conditions that exist across national territories in relation to Indigenous communities. And then we had a discussion about the research dimensions as well, and particularly again this issue of the quality of data that you can use and analyse to form robust conclusions. And we talked about different strategies that you might use to overcome that, including the use of case studies, using different qualitative research methods, but recognising that in all of this, we need to move beyond describing what happened, but to actually understand how and why things happen. Because unless you get to how and why, you cannot draw generalised conclusions which are useful for governments and in communities in making better decisions, and that's a key challenge for this project. What we did before this event is we sent a questionnaire to government agencies that are involved in this project about what they want to get out of this. And as Flavia said, her reflection was that there are a lot of commonalities in the discussion yesterday, and we recognise that in each country there are different legal frameworks, there are different political economy models of how you manage the economy, etc. But there are themes which came out, and certainly in the common themes. And so in the questionnaire, there were a couple of common themes that came out. And I think one is developing a better framework and better evidence about how Indigenous economies work in a regional context. This is an important theme which came through. Second is that, again, that this OECD framework for regional development that I described is suited to understanding and developing better policies about that topic. Third was the focus on developing clear policy recommendations which governments can use and act upon, supported by evidence, which again is tailored to that national context. In terms of the types of territories, and this is an important discussion for us today about what types of territories we want to focus on. Generally across the responses from countries, there was a focus on the rural areas, so the areas outside major metropolitan centres, and being able to focus on different policy areas that help support economic development, so around infrastructure, land, support for small business, support for entrepreneurs, and skills as well. And then by coming together in this group, people also saw value in that, in terms of being able to create a common pool of knowledge about this topic, to be able to peer review each other, both between policymakers, but also between Indigenous leaders, and through that collective effort, you create a legacy that and a value that we can all draw from. In terms of today, there are three things, two of which relate to the project. One is about better understanding policy and economic development issues related to Indigenous people in each of the countries, and how each country is thinking about implementing this project. So it's about sharing knowledge around that topic. And second, this afternoon we'll have a workshop discussion about the project outputs and methodology, and so we need to get some agreement around that, which will enable us to move forward and implement this work. And lastly, we're going to experience the delights of old Quebec, which I'm sure everyone is looking forward to. So that's it from me, and I think I'll just hand back to Mara to, or sorry, to
That's her favorite to
Anna. Yes. Yeah. Yes, sorry.
Chris, can you put your first slide back up
Sure.
again? I was just looking at this and just on the first bullet,
Yep.
it talks about the maximizing growth potential, bottom up.
Yep.
Bottom up, you mean by the communities, right? And is that what you're talking about?
Yes. Yes.
I always, to me, it's a little bit of a foreign kind of a structure because everything that we do and any organization charts or anything like that, our communities are always at the top, putting the direction downwards. And I think that that's it's just something that it's really hard for me to kind of wrap my thinking around about coming from sort of like the bottom. I think that that's where all of our direction always comes from, and so it's a little bit different, kind of maybe a different worldview. I don't know, but it seems a little bit different in that respect, and just on the where it says enabling role for government. I think I really want to. I understand what you mean. You're talking about having the supports in place for Indigenous people to make a good decision, and I just when I see that linked with regional development, it just concerns me that it might be just misread as a way to look at ways that the government can enable development themselves. And so I think that's not what the point is, as we talked about yesterday. So I think just a little bit of clarity on, especially on the first points there. Yeah. I just wanted to add to that. I know that's what you're reading, but if somebody else is reading that, it might be misread in a different way. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that observation, and we certainly have to be careful in the project that we don't use words which mean different things in other contexts. And I think for us, we're looking at how you how you promote growth in different types of regions. And so over time, governments have used different ways of doing that. In the past, it was usually designed by governments, by national governments. So those governments designed strategies, they selected the projects, they implemented them, and the community didn't have a great say over that. Now, that's not just related to Indigenous communities, that's generally how governments across the OECD approached regional economic development. And what we've seen over the last sort of 20 years is a shift towards more communities themselves developing that vision for development. So rather than it coming from the top, it's coming more from the bottom. And
So as a clarification of terminology, Don, I wonder what if another term that's used for bottom-up development is community-led development. And is that a more appropriate term in your estimation?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
Hi. Good morning. Did we just have the Swedish delegation join us, represented from the government of Sweden?
Hi, over the phone?
Yes, good morning. Would you please introduce yourselves?
Yes, hello. I'm Inga Turesson Hallgren from Stockholm, from the Ministry of Enterprise and Innovation, together with some colleagues here working with regional development. Hello to colleagues and chair.
Good morning, Inga. Thank you for joining us. So this morning we have split the session of currency policy framework and approach to the project in two parts. In the first part, we're going to have interventions from Sweden, European Commission, and Colombia. Then after the coffee break, we'll have Canada, Australia, and Peru. So for this first part, we have 1.5 hours in total. So I suggest a presentation of about 20 minutes, so we have some time for discussion at the end. And we start with you then, Inga Thoresen-Hallgren from the Director General Ministry of Enterprise and Innovation is going to talk about the currency policy framework in Sweden. So, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to start by saying that Sweden really appreciates the initiative of the OECD to do this thematic study about indigenous people. And a special thanks to Canada Economic Development for Quebec region in collaboration with other Canadian RDAs and Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. I've heard from my colleagues that you have been taking lead in this project. And even though we couldn't attend in person, a big thanks to Huron Wendake First Nation for hosting this kickoff workshop. Are you shifting the slides, or do we do it ourselves?
They are doing it.
You are doing it. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Good.
Second picture.
Second slide, please. Some facts about Sweden. We are approximately 10 million inhabitants, almost 1,600 kilometers or 975 miles from north to south. The country is divided into 21 counties or regions and 290 municipalities. From a governance point of view, the national level and the municipalities are the strong levels with many towns. The regional level is much smaller when it comes to tasks, but you find healthcare here. And important responsibilities within rural and regional development. Slide 3, please. And then some facts about Sapmi. When it comes to the area where the Sami people live, called Sapmi, it stretches from Norway over Sweden and Finland and all the way to the Kola Peninsula in Russia. Since there hasn't been any censuses of the Sami population after World War II, we can only estimate the size of the Sami population. The majority lives in Norway, and in Sweden there are approximately 20,000 to 35,000 Sami people. As I'm sure the Sami representative, Mr. Stefan Mikaelsson, has already told you, the Sami have developed a culture and ways of life that are directly connected to the areas of land and water where they live. Reindeer husbandry is traditional occupation for the Sami population, and it's still very important both for making living and as a carrier of the culture. Slide number 4, please. The reindeer husbandry right in Sweden is a right to use the land. It's based on custom and it's unrestricted. There are approximately 5,000 reindeer owners in Sweden, and about half of them have their main income from reindeer husbandry. The government allocates an annual amount of 104 million Swedish kronor about 50 million Canadian dollars for actions that all promote reindeer husbandry. Slide number 5, please. The Sami people are recognized as an indigenous people in Sweden. This status was confirmed by an amendment that was made in 2011 in one of the constitutional laws of Sweden. Consequently, there is an obligation of public power in Sweden to promote the opportunities of the Sami people to preserve and develop a culture and social life of their own. The government has raised its level of ambition in its Sami policy. One objective of Sami policy is to promote the thriving Sami culture based on ecologically sustainable reindeer husbandry and other Sami livelihoods and enterprises. It also applies to the rights of the Sami people to self-determination. The Sami livelihoods do also need to be addressed. Sweden hopes that the outcome of the study can illuminate opportunities on how the government can continue to promote the Sami people to retain and develop their cultural and social life alongside new appropriate forms of Sami livelihood. In 2011, negotiations began between the governments of Finland, Norway, and Sweden on a Nordic Sami Convention. The text has now been submitted to the three Sami parliaments for consideration. One of the cornerstones of that convention is that the state in each country shall consult with the Sami parliament when enacting laws, making decisions, and taking other actions which may be of particular significance for the Sami people. Slide number 36, please. And now something about the study. A few examples of questions especially interesting in the case of Sweden. We'd like to study how existing tools, actions, and regulations in the areas of both rural and regional development work out for Sami society and businesses. And if they do not work out, how they can be adjusted, or if we need to add something. And here we find a gender perspective and the inclusion of young people especially interesting. We would also like to map barriers to Sami participation, especially at regional level, from an economic and organizational perspective. And if necessary, provide suggestions on how to overcome potential barriers. Furthermore, chart how Sami society, businesses, and organizations are integrated in the different levels of decision making and cooperation processes and regulations in order to create synergies for regional, rural, and Sami development. And we would like to get proposals for sustainable measures that promote regional, rural, and Sami development. Slide number 7, please. Now something about the regional growth policy in Sweden. There's a national goal for regional growth, and furthermore the government has carried out a national strategy with priorities providing a policy framework for the development of all regions in Sweden. Regional growth policy in Sweden is state and in many aspects decentralized. This is true also when it comes to resources and state funding. Every single region should develop and create growth based on their specific conditions, opportunities, policy areas do contribute to regional growth, as does a number of actors on different levels of society, including national, regional, and local levels. Consequently, the policy do focus on multi-level governance and coordination of different sectors and actors. One body in every county or region has been appointed to take lead in this policy area. Some years ago, these bodies were regional state agencies. Today, they are regional political bodies in different forms. And this major change has, of course, influenced regional policy a lot over the last years. These political regional bodies are responsible to establish and implement the regional development strategy in their county. The strategy can be seen as an umbrella for sustainable growth and development. And it's also an umbrella for more specific strategies, for example, innovation strategies, commercial strategies, and programs. Consequently, the regional level is a key factor when it comes to the Sami community participating in regional development. The region will also decide over state funding and provide grants to projects and SMEs, influence the priorities of the European Union structural funds programs in Sweden, and they also monitor and evaluate regional development. National and regional state agencies do also play an important part in regional growth. They must take both the national and the regional strategies into account in their work. Slide number 8. The two most Northern European Union regional fund programs of Sweden provide opportunities for activities that develop Sami enterprise. For example, there is a focus on tourism and cultural and creative industries and enhancing the competitiveness of small and medium-sized enterprises. The Sami will also have some influence of the implementation of the program since they are a part of the monitoring committee. Slide number 9, please. Something about rural policy. Currently, there are no coherent rural policy in Sweden. Rural policy today is a bundle of measures undertaken in different policy areas like agriculture policy, regional policy, transportation policy, education policy, and so on. However, through the European Union, Sweden has big financial and methodological instruments for rural development, and that is the Common Agriculture Policy, CAP, and the Rural Development Program. The aims of the programs are foster competitiveness of agriculture, ensure sustainable management of natural resources and climate change measures. It's also to achieve a balanced territorial development of rural economies and communities. On a regional level, this program is governed by regional state agencies. This is different from the regional policy, where the responsibility is on political bodies. However, at the moment, a bill for new coherent rural policy is being prepared. This bill will include the national objectives for rural development, and it will be presented in the spring 2018. Slide number 10, please. The Sami population can take part of many of the measures in the rural development program. It's the Sami parliament that handles the measures directed to the Sami community within the program. The measures consist of investing And it's about implementation of the project. Different actors, we need to engage different actors during the study. Most important are, of course, the Sami community, the Sami organizations, and the Sami parliament. Since much of rural and regional policy is decentralized, we do have to involve the regions in an early stage. And then, of course, we have the ministries and state agencies as well. And that was all. It will be a pleasure to be part of the study together with you, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Inga, for that very clear presentation. I think all the countries will have a lot to learn about the Swedish case, and you raised some interesting issues about appropriate forms of livelihoods, for instance, that have to be tackled, but most importantly, things related to multiple levels of governance and governance issues when there are many different levels of governments and bodies that are responsible for indigenous development, as well as the need for coherent policy framework. So we're looking forward to hear about this new bill coming up. Maybe we can hear more about it during the questions and answers. But for now, we're going to give the floor to Fiona Hartford from MAR, European Commission. She's going to talk about development in the Arctic region. Fiona, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Welcome to this session. So as I said, we will have about 20 minutes for your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you from our perspective, from the EU perspective. And apologies for not being able to be there today. So I hope we can contribute like this from Brussels. So let's go to the next slide. Just to give you an idea about the timeline here for Arctic involvement at EU level. We started working on Arctic issues in 2008, really because, so you see from a historical perspective, this is not sort of a very old policy, it's rather new, and it also, I think, reflects very much the growing importance of the Arctic for the EU in terms of the strategic importance of the region. And then since 2008, we have been developing this policy. We have put forward a new sort of updated policy in 2012, and the most recent initiative that we put forward dates from 2016, so last year, and that is the current, let's say, framework, policy framework for the Arctic. And it's also within this framework that we have that we work on issues affecting indigenous people. So that's why I would like to share a little bit more about this framework. So if we go to the next slide, we see that in fact our current policy framework is built on 3 pillars. We have first the pillar of climate change and environmental protection, which recognizes that climate change is a massive issue. It's affecting the Arctic, and in terms of what is happening in the Arctic in terms of response to climate change is also having an effect on the rest of the world. So this is a key aspect of our policy. The second point of attention is the issue of sustainable development. This is focusing very much on the fact that the Arctic, that the European Arctic is an area where people live. This is an area where there is economic growth, economic activity, and linked to that, there is a need to make sure that this is done, or that it is happening in a sustainable manner. So you see that there is really also a potential tension between the first And then a third pillar of our policy is international cooperation, the recognition that what is happening in the Arctic is something that really transcends national borders, and so that we do need to work at international level to tackle those challenges and to make the best of the opportunities that the region offers. So the next slide gives you a little bit more of an idea of what we have tried to formulate to the first challenge, the challenge of climate change and environmental protection. So we have, first of all, big investment in research, Arctic research, because the EU is one of the major contributors to Arctic research. We think that if we understand better what is going on in the Arctic, we will be able to respond also in a more effective way. Secondly, we have our attempts to deal with climate change adaptation and mitigation. Here, we're talking about trying to achieve the objectives that the EU has committed to in the framework of, for example, the Paris Agreement. You know, the challenge of keeping temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So these are issues that we think have to be also addressed. And linked to that, we have the third one, the environmental management measures, where we are trying to also develop at multilateral level more ways to better manage the environment of what's going on in the Arctic. So the next, if we go to the next slide, we see also our policy responses for the sustainable development issue. Here, what we're trying to do in the Arctic is very much focused on innovation, shift to supporting a shift to the low carbon economy, but also harnessing traditional knowledge and trying to support cold climate technology, bringing innovative solutions to the market. So really to use the Arctic as also an area of opportunity to harness innovation. I'll jump to the third bullet, which is boosting green and blue growth. So again, linked to innovation, but really trying to make economic development happen in a sustainable way. For example, through renewable energy, but also developing maritime activities which are sustainable. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and that this is something that needs to be brought together, and the EU can be a catalyst for that. With the funding we have available, we can really try to make that happen. And then the third point, which is something I'll come back to later, is the streamlining of EU funding, and this we're trying to do through the Arctic Stakeholder Forum, which is a forum we set up to try and identify what kind of investment priorities are needed in the Arctic and how we can better streamline, organize these funding to meet those needs. This is something that is rather new, and it's a temporary initiative. So as I said, I'll come back to this in a minute. And then if we look at the next slide, we have here our response to the issue of international cooperation. So really, we're trying to work through existing international organizations like the Arctic Council, to promote what is in the interest of the Arctic region. At international level, we're also trying to involve in the negotiations for a new agreement to manage fisheries in the Arctic high seas, but again, working with the different stakeholders. In terms of scientific cooperation, we're trying to make sure that science is not limited to interactions between EU scientists, but that scientists from all over the world are involved in the work that we're doing, so that we can share that experience more widely project, to the work that we're doing here in the framework of this project. We, at EU level, we've always considered that having a dialogue with indigenous people is important. In terms of the Arctic, of course, they are the people who are living there. They are the ones who are experiencing the challenges that have just been outlined. And so it's logical and absolutely necessary that they are involved in any debate that is going on the Arctic. They have, I would say, an influential voice, but more can be done. And this is what we're trying to do through this dialogue. The dialogue is an annual meeting where we representatives from the EU institutions meet with indigenous people, and we inform them of what we're doing at our level. So we share information about policy processes, things that are of interest to them. But also very much we're in listening mode and trying to get their ideas for how policy processes should be steered in which direction, and what their thoughts are on what is going on. So the last meeting we had was in June, and I think it was a very interesting experience, because the idea is that we focus on those issues that are interesting to them. So it's very much the indigenous people representatives who are driving the process. They're setting the agenda, and at the last meeting, the focus was very much on things like innovation, attracting private investment, sustainability, but also the need to invest more in infrastructure and to foster international cooperation. So I think that certainly these are the themes that we identified and that we're working with them on. In terms of format, it's quite inclusive. We have representatives not just from indigenous peoples who are living in the European Union, but we also, of course, have representatives from other Arctic areas, so from Russia, Canada, the US, and Greenland. And one of the interesting things that came out of the last discussion we had was, should we be talking amongst each other only? Like, is this a dialogue, between the EU institutions and the indigenous people representatives, or should we be opening up this format and including other people, other stakeholders, active stakeholders, so that they can actually hear what is being said? And at the last meeting, we had an open session, and I think it was something. So this was the first time we did this, and I think everybody kind of thought that this is a good idea. We need to be not just talking about these issues between us, but we need to also make sure that other people hear what is being said. And so we're thinking perhaps of repeating this kind of format for the future. The second.
Hello? Anybody over the phone?
Just wait a few minutes.
Hello? Well. Hello?
Hello? Yes, this is Fiona. We got cut off. I don't know if,
Yes.
Welcome back.
I'll just I'll continue as if nothing happened. We can move forward in the slides because I was actually. Can we move to the slide that says Arctic Stakeholder Forum?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So in addition to the Indigenous Peoples Dialogue that I was mentioning earlier, what we're also doing is so we've created this Arctic Stakeholder Forum, which is a temporary initiative just running this year in 2017, where we're bringing Arctic stakeholders at regional level, but also at governmental level, and very importantly, also the representatives of Sami people, so the Sami through the Sami Council. And the approach here is very much bottom up. We're listening to their ideas and what they think are the investment priorities that we need to be pushing in the future, and also how we can improve the EU funding that is available for the Arctic region. And this work will feed into the next EU budget, so as of 2020. So this is still a long way off, but of course preparations for this have started already, and we need to make sure that we have that feedback so that we can feed that into the process early to make sure that it's taken into account. So in terms of timetable, we've been having consultations in the first half of 2017, and our aim is to produce a summary report of those consultations by the end of the year. So as I said, then in principle at the end of 2017, the forum is supposed to be wrapped up, but we're already thinking that we actually want to continue having a more, a structured dialogue with Arctic stakeholders. And so the idea is to have an annual conference, a long-term commitment to have that annual sort of meeting to discuss with stakeholders what kind of investments are needed and how they can access EU funding. So as part of the, and that's the next slide, as part of the stakeholder forum, we received input from the Sami Council, the paper that they submitted and also the meeting we had with them in February shows very much that they are facing a certain number of challenges, which is that, of course, the Sami people are distributed across several states. So they have an issue with borders, which is not that easy to solve. Of course, they are living, many of them, in remote areas, in sparsely populated areas, where climate is an issue, where the cold conditions are rather extreme. And one of the other aspects that they have themselves raised with us is, of course, that their interests don't always coincide with the interests of what I would call big business. For example, one of the examples they gave is indeed the people engaged in reindeer husbandry feel that some infrastructure projects are not taking into account their needs. And so there is certainly this wish to be consulted more upstream when decisions are made that can impact their livelihoods. That is not to say that they themselves identify that their infrastructure is something that is absolutely necessary for their economic development. But they're saying we need to be consulted more, and we need to have a say. We need to be able to give our consent to these projects. So that's the last bullet, this need for free, prior, and informed consent. And at EU level, certainly we need to be watchful that the EU funding that goes to the Arctic region, that the views of the Sami people is that these views are taken into account when we develop those funding streams, and also then when projects are implemented, that they are implemented in respect of the rights of indigenous peoples. So in terms of the priorities that they identified in their paper, the focus was very much on education and research. I already mentioned infrastructure. Healthcare was also access to healthcare was also identified as a major issue for them, as well as language and culture, businesses, and also the planning for emergency situations. So these are the priorities they identified. In terms of access to funding, one of the things that they felt, and this is actually the title of the paper that they submitted, is we do not need much, but we need even more. So what they're saying is we are not asking for millions of euros. We're asking for fairly small amounts that will already go a long way, but we're having difficulty accessing that funding. Because at EU level, the way funding is organized, very often we're looking for economies of scale, and so preference is given to bigger projects. And this is, of course, an issue for the Sami who don't necessarily have the institutional capacity to be able to access this kind of funding. So this is I would say an overview of what is happening at EU level in terms of the Arctic and our discussions with indigenous people. But I hope you found it helpful and interesting. And of course, I'm here to respond to any Q&A that you may put forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. It is certainly very interesting, and I think your idea of Arctic Stakeholder Forum, I see heads nodding around the table and say they really agree that your intervention was extremely helpful because it gives us another vision, especially with your experience of Arctic Stakeholder Forum, and you touch upon how it is important to engage not only indigenous communities and governments, but also all different stakeholders that participate in these processes. So we want to hear in the Q&A for sure more about your experience with building this forum, how that worked out and what kind of stakeholders engage in it. You also talked about very important issues related to streamlining and coordination of different sources of funding, which is something that generally the EU is involved in, but that is also something very relevant for all indigenous communities that get sources of funding from different levels of government, international organizations, or different territorial levels. But there's sometimes coordination problems with who takes responsibility for that can create governance problems. So we're going to come back to those issues as well in the Q&A. I hope you can join us until the end. If we lost you, just yell, and we'll hook you back up, because we do want to have you for that very interesting session of Q&A coming up. But before that, we have our last intervention for this part. Representative of Colombia, Maria Teresa from National Planning, is going to talk about the Colombian experience to the policy framework for indigenous development.
Hold it. Esa.
Oui. Elle a la clé. Oui. Tu peux l'envoyer, que je puisse te présenter, puis que je puisse t'envoyer les interprètes. Ok. Tu me... Non, c'est ta présentation est sur le clé?
Oui.
Oui.
Primero un contexto general de lo que es
no solo la población indígena de Colombia, sino la población en general colombiana. Tenemos reconocidos pues, grupos étnicos diferentes, los indígenas, el pueblo romo y afrocolombiano. Del total, esos son datos, como decíamos ayer, del censo 2005, que es el último censo nacional de población que tenemos. De acuerdo a esa información, en Colombia el 3.43% de la población se había autorreconocido como perteneciente a un pueblo indígena. La siguiente, por favor. Datos como que la composición, la distribución por género está en los grupos indígenas de 50.5% para hombres y 49.5% para mujeres. Y había contestado a la pregunta de asistencia al centro educativo como 327.000 personas y no 876.000, lo que da, digamos, como un indicativo de lo que es el nivel educativo de los pueblos indígenas del país. Ahora, como decíamos ayer, la Constitución Política de Colombia reconoce una serie de derechos individuales y colectivos a los pueblos. Dentro de esos derechos mencionó específicamente de la consulta previa, porque aquí digamos, ha sido mencionado como un requerimiento y una necesidad de la interrelación entre los pueblos y el Estado. Y efectivamente, Colombia lo reconoce y establece la consulta previa como un derecho a la participación a la que se debe cumplir en el caso de proyectos, obras o actividades o para iniciativas legislativas o administrativas. Dentro de esos derechos colectivos, Colombia reconoce los territorios indígenas como territorios de propiedad colectiva, inembargables e inalienables. Digamos, hoy y en el marco de la nación unitaria que somos, con un sistema descentralizado, reconoce la posibilidad de que los hoy territorios indígenas reconocidos como resguardos se conviertan en una categoría territorial, que son las entidades territoriales indígenas. Y en ese tránsito, digamos, es que estamos caminando. La siguiente, por favor. La anterior. Digamos que esto es importante. ¿En qué sentido? En que tanto la posibilidad de ser reconocidos como entidad territorial genera un nivel de autonomía como cada una de las entidades territoriales que existen en el país, pero además no se alcanza a ver que tengan por el lado derecho, estamos hablando de los recursos con que hoy cuentan esos niveles territoriales para la prestación de bienes y servicios a sus comunidades. Y en el caso de los resguardos indígenas, estamos hablando de una asignación directa de la participación en los ingresos corrientes de la nación, que llamamos asignación especial del Sistema General de Participaciones. Pero también, en el marco del otro sistema presupuestal que tiene Colombia, que es el que distribuye los ingresos por la explotación de recursos del subsuelo, también hay unos fondos con unos puntos específicos de recursos para ser gestionados por las comunidades indígenas. Entonces, no solo, digamos, tenemos la necesidad de unas políticas públicas para generar desarrollo, sino también una responsabilidad de generar un fortalecimiento para que los territorios indígenas, sus comunidades y autoridades puedan hacer una mejor inversión de los recursos a los que hoy tienen derecho por Constitución. ¿Podemos pasar, por favor? Perdón. Este es el monto de los recursos que hoy en 2017 se distribuyen dentro de los 804 resguardos indígenas que existen legalmente constituidos. Son 170.000 millones de pesos del año 2017 que, de acuerdo a la tasa que aparece en el periódico, son 58.5 millones de dólares. Esos recursos son solo para población que está en resguardo, o sea, población que tiene seguridad jurídica sobre su territorio. Y esa población es, en 2017, 1.218.278 personas. La siguiente, por favor.
Digamos que en este momento esa es la situación como hoy se ejecutan esos recursos y cómo en el contexto de descentralización los resguardos hacen parte de un territorio municipal y los recursos del Sistema General de Participación, si bien son un derecho constitucional, se tienen que administrar a través de las entidades municipales, porque los resguardos no tienen la condición jurídica, el carácter jurídico que les permita administrar recursos públicos. En la columna del lado izquierdo están los instrumentos de planeación que por los que cuenta el país. Tenemos los planes de ordenamiento territorial, los planes de desarrollo a nivel departamental, municipal y a nivel de resguardo hablamos de un instrumento que se llama el plan de vida. Plan de vida que es mencionado incluso en la ley de planeación nacional, digamos, bueno, y está sujeta a modificaciones por la que existe. Lo incorpora ese instrumento, en mi concepto, es un instrumento valioso sobre el que tendríamos que desarrollo económico, revisar, porque es un concepto que creo yo está hoy un poco vacío, digamos, el instrumento existe, como gobierno siempre estamos exigiendo que los proyectos que presenten los pueblos indígenas en el marco de sus planes de vida, que esté orientado a la generación de su desarrollo propio, pero realmente no está cualificado, digamos, el instrumento. Que para lograr convertirse en entidades territoriales indígenas debe estar de por medio una ley de ordenamiento, una ley orgánica de ordenamiento. La que existe no mencionó ni reglamentó el tema de las entidades territoriales indígenas, lo cual es una deuda, digamos, y ha generado una serie de tensiones en el relacionamiento entre los pueblos indígenas y el gobierno colombiano. No obstante, la siguiente, por favor. La siguiente. Es que es una parte de lo que tenía ayer, que tiene la siguiente. Allí. No obstante, en el año 2014 y tras movilizaciones sociales, los pueblos indígenas lograron que el gobierno nacional sacara un decreto que es transitorio, la reglamentación que avanza hacia la creación de esas entidades territoriales. Y hoy permite, es el decreto 1953 de 2014, este decreto hoy permite que los resguardos, previo una certificación entre unos requisitos, puedan administrar directamente los recursos de la asignación especial. Eso los está llevando ya a una situación en que están siendo asimilados, aquellos que se certifican son asimilados a entidades del Estado y tienen que comenzar a operar, digamos, en la misma lógica, los mismos mecanismos de seguimiento, monitoreo, todas las responsabilidades frente a la ejecución de recursos públicos. Eso los hace ganar en autonomía, pero también nos demanda, digamos, una responsabilidad frente a cuáles son las capacidades que generamos para que eso se haga bien. Digamos, si esto es para mí un contexto súper importante en el que se enmarca un posible proyecto de desarrollo económico, pues, por eso yo ayer insistía tanto, digamos, que merece el territorio indígena y la institucionalidad y las fortalezas y las capacidades que se están generando. Bueno, solo como dato, hoy hay 8 resguardos, 7 resguardos indígenas certificados y una asociación de resguardos que apoya a 9 resguardos, para un total de 16 o 17. En términos de ordenamiento territorial, porque si esto se enmarca en un contexto de desarrollo regional, tendría que precisar que Colombia hoy está en su segunda generación de planes de ordenamiento territorial. Y en esa nueva, llamamos planes de ordenamiento territorial modernos al programa que está detrás de todo esto. Y se supone que ya hay una visión más amplia de lo que es el territorio, haciendo el continuo entre lo urbano y lo rural. Y ese también, digamos, es como uno de los elementos que está sobre el ambiente en el marco de este proyecto. Entonces, hoy Colombia, digamos, hace un intento por lo menos de mirar esas relaciones como un continuo y mucho más integral que lo que hacía en la primera generación de los planes de ordenamiento. En términos de este contexto, los pueblos indígenas o las comunidades indígenas de un territorio participan a través de lo que se llama el Consejo Territorial de Planeación. Y lo que voy a decir, lo digo como María Teresa Ramírez, no como funcionaria del Departamento Nacional de Planeación, yo creo que no es suficiente. No es suficiente tener un representante en un Consejo Territorial de Planeación, porque igual son intereses minoritarios, digamos, que en un contexto más regional terminan siendo muy débiles y con poca capacidad de negociar en esos contextos. En las situaciones que se están dando particulares en Colombia, solo como dato, bueno, no lo saben, pero Buenaventura, que es un municipio del Pacífico colombiano, hizo una marcha fuertísima y nos estamos sentando con ellos a revisar su plan de ordenamiento, y allí los pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes exigieron espacios específicos de concertación con ellos en términos de su visión de desarrollo. Lo mismo como COA, que hubo una avalancha, una avenida torrencial hace un par de meses que destruyó medio municipio. También los indígenas, digamos, han sentado un precedente y se han organizado para que el diálogo sea en los términos distintos en el marco de construir esas visiones de desarrollo. Por lo tanto, eso es un elemento, digamos, que hay que tener en cuenta, porque no es solo su desarrollo propio de esos territorios, sino cómo dialogan en un contexto más amplio. Y ya en particular, frente a las expectativas de Colombia, en términos de la red institucional, digamos, para atender los asuntos de los pueblos indígenas, pues la verdad es que es el conjunto de gobierno. Existe un Ministerio del Interior con una Dirección de Asuntos Indígenas, que si bien es la que maneja el diálogo directo con los pueblos, su acción se centra más con el fortalecimiento del gobierno propio y de derechos humanos. La prestación de bienes y servicios se hace de todas maneras a través del resto de la estructura del gobierno. Desde el 2009, los pronunciamientos de la Corte Constitucional han presionado para que las entidades hagan unas adecuaciones a la forma en que se relacionan con los pueblos, en términos de los programas, que tengan una mayor persistencia, que respeten las autoridades propias, los mecanismos de llegada y concertación de las acciones en cada uno de los territorios, incluso hasta en el bienestar familiar, digamos que las atenciones en alimentación escolar y este tipo de cosas sean adaptadas culturalmente. Eso no es fácil, es un proceso que sigue siendo incipiente, digamos, y que los pueblos exigen que sigamos adaptándonos. Desde el Departamento Nacional de Planeación, en la Dirección de Ordenamiento de Desarrollo Territorial Sostenible, existimos nosotros como grupo de asuntos étnicos. En tanto, el tema territorial es un tema de derechos también, y nosotros en la dirección también tenemos que ver con finanzas públicas territoriales. Por lo tanto, digamos, ahí es el espacio donde de planeación hay un grupo que mira estos asuntos técnicos desde estas dos ópticas. Frente a lo que como Departamento Nacional de Planeación hemos identificado una prioridad en lo que podría ser el proyecto, no sé por qué se activa esto, pero los departamentos, yo tengo una inquietud personal, se los voy a plantear, y es que en general la política pública hace una focalización de las inversiones que tiene que ver mucho con la eficiencia del gasto. Entonces, mayor población, con menos recursos, en fin. Resulta que en términos de los pueblos indígenas en Colombia, que constitucionalmente es deber del Estado proteger la diversidad cultural, es lo que ha generado todo un desarrollo de bloques de derechos, pues la mayor parte de la diversidad cultural en Colombia está en las zonas más aisladas del país, donde los costos de la prestación de los bienes y servicios es 7 veces más alto de lo que puede ser en las zonas más conectadas con el centro del país. Entonces, digamos, como en términos de desarrollo y de política pública, ¿cómo vamos a abordar esta situación? Es una de las inquietudes que en lo personal yo tengo. Cuando uno revisa la distribución de los pueblos indígenas en Colombia, encuentra que la mayor población está en los departamentos de Bautés, Guainía, La Guajira, Bichada, Amazonas, y a excepción de La Guajira, todos los demás departamentos pertenecen al oriente colombiano, que es la Orinoquía y la Amazonía. Son las zonas más alejadas del centro colombiano y de los centros de lo que ha sido históricamente el desarrollo económico del país. Son poblaciones de unas características particulares en términos sociales y culturales. Generalmente son pueblos y comunidades con unas estructuras casi que de familia extensa, únicamente, digamos, no tienen una unidad, no me corrigen si estoy diciendo algo equivocado, mucho más horizontales, que no corresponden, digamos, como a la estructura de gobierno que el Estado ha definido en su relacionamiento, que es la del cabildo indígena, que es una figura que viene desde la colonia, que en la zona indígena ha sido amplia y fuertemente adoptada, que es mucho más difícil la interlocución. En esa zona también hay una alta dispersión poblacional, una baja densidad poblacional y unas características particulares geográficas. Estamos en toda la cuenca del Amazonas, vías básicamente solo por aire o río, y por lo tanto, pero con un alto capital ambiental, en fin, entonces se vuelve, digamos, un reto para el gobierno colombiano definir políticas públicas de prestación de bienes de servicios, en particular de desarrollo económico, para esta zona del país, que es, digamos, una de nuestras prioridades. Colombia, en su último Plan Nacional de Desarrollo, trató de darle un enfoque mucho más regional y hacer visibles esas diferencias que hay entre las diferentes regiones de Colombia. Utilizó para eso una metodología de cierre de brechas y definió 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Definió 6 zonas en su último Plan Nacional de Desarrollo. Esas. Escucha, la próxima vez cambio los colores, pero yo lo tengo en azul aquí. Y de acuerdo a esas regiones en las que el Plan Nacional de Desarrollo propone unos objetivos de desarrollo específicos, de acuerdo a esos análisis de brechas y de características geográficas, en fin, propone unos modelos de desarrollo específicos, y en la ubicación, en la distribución de los resguardos dentro de esa clasificación regional, pues el Caribe es donde está el mayor porcentaje, mentiras, en el Pacífico colombiano es donde está el porcentaje de territorios indígenas reconocidos, el Caribe le sigue, y si se dan cuenta, pues el centro sur de Amazonía solo tiene un 9%, y los llanos otro 9%, a pesar de eso, sigue siendo, en términos de población, en términos de territorios, es donde más resguardos hay. ¿Sí? En el centro sur de Amazonía el 30%, en el Pacífico está el 40%. Es decir, el 70% de los territorios indígenas en Colombia están en zonas de selva, o del litoral pacífico, o de la cuenca amazónica, por las condiciones que estoy diciendo de su desarrollo. Aunque si bien la población es la menor. Pero es donde se concentran también los indicadores de pobreza más fuertes en Colombia, por lo tanto es una necesidad alta, digamos, poder resolver cómo es el relacionamiento y cómo generamos desarrollo en esa zona. Y frente a los temas de interés, creo que lo había mencionado Javier Pérez, mi jefe, en la reunión que tuvieron en París, en la sede de Canadá, en Chantal. Estamos interesados en obtener recomendaciones precisamente para la vinculación de las comunidades indígenas en desarrollo regional, en contexto de alta dispersión geográfica y baja densidad poblacional, un modelo de administración de recursos y prestación de servicios a cargo del Estado específico para esas condiciones. Y hay un tema de estrategia de ordenamiento. ¿Por qué? Porque cuando Colombia transitó en la Constitución de 1991 en adelante, Ana, que es colombiana, se acuerda que existían los antiguos territorios nacionales, que no era una figura un poco rara, eran como los hermanos menores en el ordenamiento territorial. Cuando la Constitución del 91 todos se volvieron departamentos o municipios, pero en estas zonas del Amazonas quedaron unas áreas que no son municipios. Están en los departamentos y la Constitución no reconoce eso como una figura, entonces los mismos departamentos tienen problemas para prestar sus servicios allí, y allí es donde está un alto porcentaje de los territorios indígenas. Y también quisiéramos, ya desde la construcción que se puede hacer con las comunidades de esos territorios, pues construir unas formas innovadoras de impulsar el desarrollo propio. Yo creo que eso pasa por generar capacidades. Lo que les decía del tránsito hacia territorios indígenas está demandando la generación de capacidades dentro de los resguardos indígenas que hoy no tienen en su mayoría y que tenemos que procurarlas para que puedan asumir en el contexto de su autonomía este tipo de responsabilidades nuevas. Y por supuesto la recomendación sobre las adecuaciones de los sistemas de información para nosotros vital, digamos, reconocemos que el ejercicio de la autonomía parte por tener información que les permita tomar decisiones, como ha dicho, todo el tiempo informadas, ¿no? y con capacidades. Y ese es el resumen de mi presentación.
Thank you very much, Maria Teresa. That was very interesting. I'm sure we have a long conversation after that, but I won't be too biased in the Q&A in the case of Colombia, even though 91 I was pretty young still, but I do remember it was a big mess to change these figures. And you touched upon many interesting topics, among which I can remark the need for evaluating local territories, not only in terms of economic development, but also in terms of their capacity to manage on resources. So if we are at the stage yet, or how do you build that capacity at the local level? So it's not only about giving rights, but also building local capacity. So also in terms of who is responsible for that. That in the future, of course, the ultimate goal is that they're able to manage their own funds, but someone has to take responsibility for that. The other point that you touched upon, is the Colombia is at a stage maybe where you still have legal framework loopholes that result in service under provisions, for instance. So, like, yes, you do have territories that are protected, but that also means that some agencies don't take responsibilities for service provision. And this being all sparsely populated regions, and as you mentioned, under a model of efficiency-driven policy from the national government, you want to maximize the impact and the number of people receiving funds, then the combination of these two things result then in continued under provision. That is, of course, one of the main issues that needs to be tackled for starting talking about economic development opportunities. So I'm sure our representative from Sweden, if she's still there, Inga.
Patrick here, Inga had to leave for another meeting.
Okay. It's okay, then we can talk later. Thank you very much. But generally then, I think Colombia can learn about this new policy framework in, for instance, rural Sweden or Canada, where you have new alternatives for dealing with sparsely populated regions in a way that works under a different model that works on their rural policy framework that includes indigenous people. So I'm sure in the project there's going to be a big component about that, and we're going to hear a lot about that. But for now, I want to open the floor for questions. Dawn here is very eager to start, which I'm very happy. I think we still have Fiona with us.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, then we have Dawn is gonna make the first question. Go ahead.
Yes, actually, I was hoping Fiona was still on the line because I wanted to refer to her presentation, and I have to say that I really like the 3 pillars that you had presented. But I have to say I'd like to add a 4th pillar, and I'm almost thinking that it's these 4 pillars could be adapted to the work that this project is involved in as the main topic areas that we would be looking at. It might be something where we could fit all of the elements that we've talked about since yesterday. But the 4th pillar that I would add, and just to tell you that in my culture, the number 4 has a lot of meaning in terms of our medicine wheel and a lot of indigenous significance to us in the 4 directions. But the 4th pillar that I would add would be capacity development and institutional supports. And under that, I guess I'm talking about, this is to assist, again, Indigenous people to be more informed and build that capacity to make informed decisions on any developments taking place in their regions. And I really think that that's a key component going forward. I've repeated that several times, but because I see it's lacking in a lot of areas. So I would add that as a fourth pillar, and we could talk a little bit more about that. But I also wanted to add a few items to some of the other pillars that were mentioned. For example, under climate change, the first pillar, and environmental protection, under the detail that you had provided, I would also like consideration being given to paid land stewardship programming to be added to that. I think that that would be a really good addition to something like that. When I look at the environmental protections in there, just linked to Indigenous people, I think that that's and part of that paid stewardship programming. Then under the third pillar for international cooperation, I would add in that, and I really like all the items that you listed here, but I would add recognition of Indigenous nations, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and reconciliation. I think that those under international cooperation could be additional topics to add. But as I was looking at this, I thought it was a sort of a great type of format that maybe could help us in developing regional initiatives a little bit further and engaging Indigenous people in this type of, well, under this initiative under OECD. Thank you.
Fiona, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, well, first of all, thank you very much for those comments. I think we cannot but agree that the voice of Indigenous peoples and communities needs to be heard across the policy spectrum, so that we need to be hearing from them in terms of each components that we're developing and the responses we're developing to the challenges that we've identified. The institutional support you mentioned, indeed, this is something that that we've also had as feedback from Indigenous people communities in terms of strengthening their capacity to engage. Because, for example, the Sami Council is a very small structure, and they are, at the same time trying to reach out to their communities, which are spread over a very large area, with the challenges that involves in transportation, transport, and so on. And so this is certainly something that we're looking at addressing through EU funding. In terms of the feedback dynamic that we have developed in the stakeholder forum, I would say, because this is one of the things you commented on immediately after my presentation, I would say that actually it's been an extremely good dynamic, and most of the dynamic is coming from the stakeholders themselves. Sometimes we're actually having trouble keeping up with them. They're so keen to drive forward their agenda that sometimes we have to sort of say, stop, hang on a minute, because, of course, at EU level, policy making is something that is rather slow. And so we're constantly having to sort of, to say, okay, let's do this, but we need to sort of slow down a bit.
but it's been gratifying to get this kind of input. And certainly, as I said, they are driving the process. They're very keen on making their voices heard. And then the other issue you mentioned, the coordination issues we have with Arctic funding. This is definitely one of the main problems that we've identified, that we have different funding streams, targeting regional development, but also research, and they're not run by the same people, they're not part of the same program. And although we try to build synergies, we are aware that we're not always getting it right, and that sometimes there are gaps and sometimes there are overlaps. And so going forward, one of the main points of attention is going to be making sure that we improve. I'm not going to say that we'll be able to get it 100% right, but certainly we are aware that there's an issue, and we're looking at developing that. In terms of international cooperation, indeed, the role of indigenous communities is something that is important, and the EU has also worked on the rights of indigenous peoples more generally. So not just focusing on the Arctic and the Sami people, but also more generally through its work at UN level. And this is something we're committed to doing, and that we will continue to drive forward. I hope that sort of responded to some of your remarks.
Yes, thank you very much. Just for the information of yourself and Warren, a friend from Australia, yesterday we talked about one of the institutional supports being, for example, in our region, we're developing a center of excellence for Indigenous mineral development, so that there's a place for Indigenous people to go to seek expertise and it's a clearinghouse of information on leading practices and templates with regards to engaging Indigenous people in the minerals development industry, and but it also is an institution that supports information sharing in terms of the proper protocols and working with Indigenous people for groups that are working with Indigenous people. So it's a place where that those supports would be available to communities who might not have that expertise themselves, so they can find out where they can go for environmental expertise, legal expertise, financial expertise, consulting expertise in that industry. So when I talk about institutional supports, I'm talking more about those types of things that are there to help build the capacity and the knowledge base of Indigenous people who are facing sometimes a barrage of project proposals in their regions.
Yes, I mean that's exactly the kind of challenge that certainly has come out of the contribution of the Sami Council to our consultation. This is exactly the kind of structure that they would like to develop, and that they think they need to be able to strengthen their voice. So yes, of course, one of the issues we have at EU level is that is what kind of, are we supporting something that already exists? Do we want to be creating something new? Where is the funding going to come from? So these are discussions which we are having with Arctic stakeholders. But so far we have not really, I would say, found a satisfactory response to that. And so I'm glad you raised it.
Well, thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Christopher?
Thank you, Anna. Christopher Duchan from the Department of Indigenous Affairs of the Government of Canada. I guess it's a question, just picking up on that, and sort of a question for Fiona as well. Canada, in our large and complex union with federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous governments, often runs the risk of there's a chance of duplication and there's a chance of overlap of services. So I'm wondering, in looking in the context of what the European Commission is doing, where the work of the Arctic Stakeholders Group, where that fits into the work of the Arctic Council, and what you are doing to ensure that there's complementarity and not overlap. And then I guess how what could possibly be overlap there, how that is managed. Because we face that on a daily basis in Canada, not just in an Arctic context, in a circumpolar Arctic context, but in a domestic context as well.
Yes, I think everything we do at EU level, we run the risk of duplication or overlap and even gaps. So I think this is inherent in having, that policy making and funding from that kind of level. So having said that, in terms of the Arctic, yes, we are working through the Arctic Council where possible, because we are observers, we have observer status. So we attend the meetings whenever we can to different working groups. We contribute to the work of the Arctic Council. And so there is an awareness of what is going on there, and we're trying to make sure when we define investment priorities and funding programs for the future that we know what other people are doing, what is being done at national level by EU member states, but also other countries and other structures. But it is not always easy, because there is so much. So much is being done, which is a good thing, but it can be a challenge to get that information. So yeah, we're always open to having those additional channels, and that's why the discussions we have with the Arctic stakeholders and with Indigenous peoples is so important.
Thanks. I think in the context of the case studies are going to unfold, the question of governance and multi-levels of jurisdiction and complementarity versus overlap, I would like to see that as a theme that runs throughout that. Thanks.
Yes, definitely. Stefan.
Thank you very much. My name is Stefan Mikaelsson, and I am chair of the Livelihood Committee. Previously, I have been chairing the Sami Parliament Plenary Assembly for 8 years on Swedish side. In 1998, I had the privilege to attend the roundtable conference in Brussels, organized by the European Commission. We were discussing policy for indigenous people outside the European Union. It was rewarding and beneficial, but time has not stood still. It has continued on, and the development of international rights concerning indigenous peoples, and also domestically in Sweden and Finland, has moved on. 1751, the border treaty between belligerent countries of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were signed. And in an annex, the Sami nation were given certain rights, and they are so impressive and important that some name this annex to the Strömstads Treaty as the Sami people Magna Charta. And it's still valid today. It can be used in court trials, it can be used in daily work for the reindeer herders and everyone else. In 1992, the Nordic Sami Council had a Sami conference in Helsinki, in Finland, and representatives for the Kola Peninsula organizations, Kola Sami Peninsula organizations attended, and they applied for membership in Nordic Sami Council, and they also become members. And the organization changed name from Nordic Sami Council and to Sami Council. The Sami family was whole again, and the borders of the national state could not prevent the community of the Sami people. It is only 25 years ago, and not so much has happened when it comes to Sweden and Finland, both member countries of the European Union. despite appeal from the European Union Parliament to immediately and without delay ratify ILO 169, Sweden and Finland says no. It is important that responsible state in the richest part of the world ratifies human rights instrument, not only rights for the child, not only rights for indigenous, for the rights for the women, but also the right for indigenous peoples. And as I stated yesterday, but repeat now, the human rights for indigenous peoples are not a threat to human rights for non-indigenous. Today, we have a much better situation in Sweden. The indigenous people are acknowledged in the Swedish constitution as a people, and added to that the 1751 legal document. We are in a unique position to take the lead, to know our own good and talk on behalf of ourselves. No one Swedish state official can do that any longer. But do we want to do that? Do we jeopardize to the friendship that we have worked up and living in dominating societies with Swedish neighbors? Is it worth the risk to jeopardize to get an uncertain privilege and without known outcome? So we are a little about hesitating in how to do. Recently, we had the Nordic Summit Convention as a discussion at the joint meeting between the three summit parliaments. And we were unanimously agreeing to continuing a common process in Summit Parliamentarian Council, the working body for the three summit parliaments, and to try to establish a joint statement. Maybe it will be ready the 6th of February, when it's 100 years anniversary for the second border crossing meeting. This 1918 border crossing meeting were held in Östersund in Sweden, where the Sami people, Sami representatives were meeting in the midst of burning First World War, because they knew something terrible was going to happen to the Sami rights. And still today, we have gained a lot, we have learned a lot, and we are using the importance, the human rights laws that are changing to the better, involving indigenous peoples and not excluding. We have been using that, so we are almost as smart as we say we are in election campaigns. But still today, many indigenous women in Sweden are excluded to use traditional territories, to execute and to uphold and to deliver Sami culture to their grandchildren or to their relatives' grandchildren or to the neighbors' grandchildren, because the law says it is illegal. It is only the member of the Sami villages that in some cases are allowed to visit certain areas. It is not how it should be, and it's not in accordance with, for instance, the country. I will not take so much of your time, but for me it was important to mention these certain events or certain conditions that severely affects the situation for the Sami parliament and for the single individual, because health is not only a question of absence of injury or damage, but it also total physical, spiritual, and social well-being. And when the law of one state so single-handed differs out indigenous women that are out of the raider husbandry, the feeling of well-being in the society is not as high as it could be. And in one of the lectures that was held by Peter Spoor at the inauguration of Sami Parliament's 7th term of office, he said that half of the invented Sami reindeer owners were affected by racism. And the Ombudsman Against Ethnic Discrimination has, in a press release 4 years ago, stated that the structural and institutional discrimination against the Sami are based on races or against the national minorities. But my main topic would be the structural funds and the program period, since it is very nice to hear that the indigenous peoples should be involved or included in the possibility in a better level than earlier to be part of applying for funding to projects that are small scale and based on long time use and ecological use of nature. But we have a huge problem with national funding, since the Sami Parliament have no national funding sources available, so we have to go through Swedish sources, and in some cases they are not so informed about Sami conditions, they are not so eager to learn either. So this is a problem that has to be solved in a much better way than the previous years. I hope that the European Commission will look into this matter. Thank you.
Shall I just respond briefly?
Yes, please.
Yes, no, Stefan, thank you very much for this feedback. Again, I acknowledge that the problem you raise about the need for co-financing, so the need for the people who are running the project to also to put money into the project to obtain EU funding. This is something that has been raised and that we are aware of. Of course, you know that EU funding is delivered through the member states, through the national programs, and this is a factor that we have to take into account, and we have to see how we can better to make sure how we can make sure that those national programs are delivering for all the stakeholders in the member states. So also the Sami people. And I think that the stakeholder forum can certainly be shared with the national authorities, so that this message is not just going to the EU decision makers, but also to decision makers at national level, that they have to take into account also priorities identified by the Sami people. So yeah, I thank you for your feedback. I think this is certainly something we need to pay attention to.
Thank you, Fiona. We have time for a short question, comment from around the table. If not, Chris will summarize some key points before calling.
Excuse me, I think we have a question over the phone.
We have a question from...
Is that someone who wants to ask a question over the phone?
Yeah, I raised the hand on the WebEx system Sweden here. It was actually, we'd like to make a comment, just if it's possible.
Certainly.
Yes, of course, go ahead.
Yeah, with just a comment on what Stefan Mikaelsson said. I'm Patrik Johansson. I'm Deputy Director on Regional Development here in Stockholm. I'm Project Manager of this study on our behalf, and I'm here with Lena Lind, who works with Rural Development. And I do acknowledge what Stefan Mikaelsson say about the problem he describes. It's true that the right to land use in Sweden is connected to reindeer husbandry, and I agree with the problems he described about that it is a gender issue as well. But it's not my field of expertise, so I can't really comment more than that. I do also agree with what you say about the right of indigenous people, that it's closely connected to human rights. When it comes to regional development in Sweden, as we described earlier, I think Inga described earlier, it has a place-based approach and a bottom-up focus on assets and multi-level governance. It's a focus on decentralized policy as well. And this should be a good base to really involve the Sami people in the policy. But of course, it's not a guarantee that we do that in a good way. And we hope that this study can help us to do that in a better way, because when the Sami people, it covers at least 5 regions, counties in Sweden, and there are many actors to have discussions with when you want to do develop something in the entire area of the Swedish part of the Sami area. So it's a decentralized system. It matches good work in a way to let the Sami people be a part of development, but there are problems as well. We can see that, and we hope this study can solve some of the issues there. And Sweden has just recently committed to this study, and we have had some contacts with the Sami parliament so far, and also with other stakeholders like the regions, and we are going to involve all parts in this study, but we have a work to do now to really get all these key stakeholders involved in this project. Yeah.
Thank you very much for those clarifications. We acknowledge your expectations for these projects. I think they are shared by many of the participants, and these are certainly things that we're going to look into. So for now, before closing this session, unless there is a short comment. Yes. Comment from Stefan.
Thank you very much. I would not appreciate to have facts delivered here which are not accurate. But of course, I have my indigenous eyes, and I can't change that. And I don't want to. It was not mentioned either. But I would like to salute the Swedish government who has, during the last weeks, taken decision very surprisingly. It came like a flash in the middle of the day, that Sami Parliament shall have increased budget with about €2.5 million. We don't know. I don't know why they took the decision now, but we are very pleased and happy. And the Swedish government had taken the responsibility they should have taken quite a long time ago. But now it came, and we are happy. Thank you very much.
Good. Do you want to reply to that very shortly, or?
Yeah, but it's a part of what Inga described earlier, that this government has raised its ambition when it comes to the Sami people, and yeah, I think that this is a part of that. To strengthen the Sami Parliament will enable them to take part in development of the Sami society, Sami businesses, etc.
Thank you very much. So thank you all the participants, also those joining us remotely. It has been a very productive session. Chris has some final comments just before we run out for coffee. You have
just a logistical item after this.
Okay, then after Marisa is gonna give some clarification in terms of logistics. Chris.
Thanks, Anna, and I won't provide a summary because I think the conversation was good, and for someone like Stefan, you're here looking through your eyes as an Indigenous leader, so those comments are valued, and that's one of the key objectives of this session. But I think for us, in terms of where we come from at the OECD, there's when we look across these countries, there's very different development context. There are very different development issues. But in terms of 2 key things, I think there were some commonalities, and one is around the territorial context that we're talking about in rural areas, because all rural areas, they have small markets. They tend to be a long way from other places. The population density is low. They tend to have lack of capacity, organisational capacity, and lower levels of human capital. And this creates challenges in terms of how you deliver economic development programs and policies. In a practical sense, you want to deliver programs or deliver them in a way which reduce barriers for small businesses and entrepreneurs in terms of accessing those resources. So the ways in which you deliver programs in urban areas and the rural areas is quite different. Things like clusters and networks are very important in terms of how businesses can work together to build scale and capacity to access new market opportunities. The other thing that we heard about was a bit about service delivery and how you deliver services in rural places. And again, it's different in terms of the importance of the co-production of services, how you work with communities to design and deliver services, how you look at different types of governance models where service systems can join together to jointly manage assets and staffing resources, the importance of the use of technology for people to access services as well. So I think for us, this territorial context and the commonalities is very important. The other important things around governance, again, the ways in which you include Indigenous communities in the development process, and then I think reflecting on the messages from Colombia, the importance of the multi-level governance, how different levels of government work together, and how Indigenous communities, if they govern land, how they are connected to the surrounding region, how they are connected to governance actors like municipalities and regional governments as well. And I'm sure this will be a common theme across the project as well. So just a comment, a couple of comments from us from our point of view.
Thank you. I'll make more profound and hopefully enlightening content comments after the next session. If you just bear with me for a minute, I will speak about a few logistical matters now. At 11, so now, the gentleman from the restaurant will come, increase the heating, and pick up your orders for the lunch. Now, I think last night you heard that we were planning, or yesterday afternoon you heard that we were planning a visit to Quebec City, the old Quebec, tonight. So it's all been organized, and I apologize for stepping out a few times this morning, but now everything is organized. We have 3 cars that will be waiting in front of the door at 5:30 this afternoon. So let's say departure at 5:40, but I would appreciate if no later than that, those interested in participating into this outing would be there at 5:30. We will go and visit the old city between, let's say, 6:15 to 7:15, 7:30. We are expected at 7:30 at the restaurant called Tour de Broche. In English, I think it's Spindletern, something like that. It's been open for 2 years. It's based on a philosophy. There are 2 pillars in their philosophy, their approach. It's eco-responsible and it's all farming cuisine. So everything made on site or brought from a farm close by and based on traditional knowledge of cuisine. They produce everything themselves. You'll see it's simple. It's a bistro approach, but there's a lot of work behind everything that they do. They make everything themselves. The meat comes from the farm. They have hides on the roof. They will bring, because at 7:30, because of insurance issues, they cannot bring us to the roof, but they will make us taste, if we want to, the alcohols of honey from the hives. They produce their herbs, spices, in the basement, the bread, the pastries, everything is made on site. They have gluten-free cuisine. I know it's a reality around the table, so you need to mention it at the get-go, but on the card, it will also be mentioned. So 5:30 in front of the door. If I could get, please, a show of hands, who is taking part in this activity, we could confirm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Excellent, all booked. 3 cars. Close quarters, so it's good that we're getting to know each other. Thank you. Have a good break. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
We have still two people over WebEx, and
many more joining via YouTube channel.
Okay, great. Welcome everybody, including our online listeners. So in a continuation of hearing from national policy frameworks, I'd like to start the session by having a presentation by Christopher.
So, Christopher Shen from the Department of Indigenous Affairs.
Si vous désirez demeurer en conférence, veuillez appuyer sur n'importe quelle touche. The system has detected that you are still connected to the and will attempt to end it. If you wish for the lines to remain connected, please press any key.
We found the any key.
You are? Okay, thanks. I think you have the copy of the presentation in front of you. I am going to try to simplify the message, and I think if I'd heard the other presentations before earlier, I probably would have structured this differently, and it gets into a lot of detail that I'm happy to take offline, but I'm going to try to sort of paint the broad strokes as to what establishes the relationship between Indigenous communities and individuals in Canada and the government of Canada, and what some of our policy responses. So, as I mentioned in my opening comments this morning, I was going to say, if we go to slide 2, that's actually me. Were you clicking? Why am I sure this? So, oh, there we go. Maybe Patrick or somebody can just move it so the whole thing is actually on the screen. No, it's just the projector that's pointing slightly next to it. Yes. So, as I mentioned in the opening, just my reflections on yesterday, from a Canadian perspective, we are at a very hopeful. This is not discounting the massive challenges that we have collectively on the Indigenous aisle, with Indigenous leadership and different levels of government, but we are at a point of significant hopefulness that there is a big momentum and huge commitment from very high levels, directly from the Prime Minister and his cabinet, to rethink and renew and reinvigorate and fundamentally change the relationship with Indigenous people in Canada. I want to acknowledge, though, what Chef Siwi said yesterday, that acknowledgement is there, but proof of it actually changing has yet to be realized. So the commitment is there, and the horizon is long, the vision is long, but the difference in tone between now and a decade ago is significant. It's important to note that in Canada, Indigenous rights and rights to self-determination, or as it's phrased in our Constitution, Aboriginal rights, are enshrined in our Constitution. Section 35 is what provides the basis of making that a legal sort of a binding and an underpinning of what our relationship is. And our recent ratification of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is sort of the more active and international manifestation of the commitment to those rights. The other thing, sort of on a more on a local level, putting all of that into action is now through a commitment of renewing that nation-to-nation relationship, as I mentioned, the Prime Minister has, and ongoing discussions and working groups between senior political leaders and senior leaders in the Indigenous communities. And I'll go through just a little bit what the structure, what the structure of Indigenous people and what the makeup is in Canada, and then how that relates to the nation-to-nation dialogue that is going on. So the Constitution recognizes that there are three major Indigenous groups in Canada. First Nations, that we've heard a lot about. When we've been talking about communities in the last couple of days, generally we hear more about First Nation communities than the other communities, but there are three groups of First Nation, and there are 630 communities. Now, getting back to my comments yesterday, those are communities that are not necessarily historic nations. Those are communities created as a result of federal policy and federal legislation. Those are reserve-based, land-based communities where that land was set aside under very, very restrictive conditions for First Nations. So what that number means in terms of historic nations, that is something that the discussion is going on. It's far, far less than 630, but 630 are more or less the recognized Indian Act bands, and I'll talk about that in a second. First Nations constitute about 2.6% of the Canadian population. What that means, again, that First Nations, those are defined under a federal piece of legislation. Who is considered a status Indian is defined by the Indian Act. Again, historical, very, very problematic piece of legislation where it is up to the government of Canada to say yes or no to stamp whether you get your card of Indian status. So that is a very significant underpinning about who the rights holders are and what the relationship is. There are many, many people in Canada who identify themselves as First Nations, as First Nation individuals, but do not have Indian Act status. I'm not going to get into that. It's very complex, and I've done it anytime you want to comment on it. But the issue, what I'm trying to get at here is the issue of identification of who is considered legally an Indian under the Indian Act versus who declares themselves as being a First Nation individual is a very contentious issue and are two very, very separate things. One is about self-identity and one is about a legal definition under the Indian Act. That issue is perhaps even more complex with the Métis population, who are a historical group that has not, until very recently, been recognized as having, they were recognized in the Constitution, but what their rights meant keeps being defined and redefined by the courts. So just a year and a half ago, a major court case, the Cap Daniels case at the Supreme Court, redefined not who Métis are, but what their rights are and what their relationship is to the federal crown, putting it on the equivalent level of the relationship that status Indians have with the crown. Very, very complex. And there are almost 500,000 Métis across Canada. Again, very, very complex to actually formally have census as to who is Métis and not. You'll see the map in a second. Many people who define themselves as Métis across the country, but who do not meet what is called the Pauli test, the legal test of identification. All of this is going to be very important in case studies because we throw the term Indigenous communities around all the time. We have to think about it in terms of rights holders. Who are the ones who actually hold Indigenous rights and what is then their relationship to the Crown and what is their relationship to economic development. And just on the Inuit, very interesting, the Canadian Arctic population, 4 distinct Inuit regions in Canada, 2 in the territories. Probably most people know about Nunavut, which is the biggest Inuit land claim. But there are 3 other territories in the Northwest Territories, in northern Quebec, in Nunavik, Arctic Quebec, in the province we're in, and in Labrador, spread out of over 53 communities. And what's very interesting about the Inuit, they have all settled their land claims. So that means, in the Canadian perspective, land rights associated with the Inuit who live in the claimant areas have been settled. It's clear. The Inuit, and just a cocktail party piece of trivia, the Inuit of Nunavut are by far the largest private landholders in the world. So they own 35,000 square kilometers outright of surface and subsurface rights. There's nobody else in the world who's anywhere near that. And they co-manage another 350,000 square kilometers. So it is absolutely massive. But in terms of regional development, land rights in the 4 Inuit regions have been settled. Important to note, though, that 20% of the Inuit, and there are only 60,000 Inuit in Canada, 20% do not live in the land claim areas, live in urban areas. So how that population links to rights in the Inuit regions is complex. You'll also see here what's to note on this very complicated chart. Canada is huge. The other thing to note, though, is look at the dark red portion of those circles, which shows the Indigenous population per jurisdiction, per province or territory. So the level of influence you can see from a regional or a territorial or provincial government perspective is going to change significantly. So talking about Nunavut, the top right-hand circle, where you see 86% of the population are Inuit. That means 86% of the population, very small population, only 27,000 people, 86% are rights holders. Very, very different than the situation in the province where we are here. There are only 141,000 recognized right holders, which is only 1.8% of the population, which means that the influence on the public policy discourse is very, very different. It's important to note, and that's not in this presentation, that the Inuit, First Nation, and Métis all have very, in my opinion, very strong and effective national representation through political advocacy groups in Ottawa, with chapters generally across the country, more or less. So there's the Assembly of First Nations, the AFN, the political advocacy group representing status Indians, and it's not always agreed as to who represents whom on the AFN and on the First Nation side. The Métis National Council, representing the Métis in Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC. So Ontario West. And then ITK, Inuit Taprit Kanatami, the National Inuit Organization, representing all the Inuit in the 4 Inuit land claims regions and the Inuit who live in urban areas. So anyway, we wanted to put this up just to show that in terms of influence, it's a very different situation, province to province. And then within that Indigenous population, you will see on the next slide, the red represents the non-status Indian population, those who identify as First Nations but are not registered, cannot register on the Indian Act. Sorry, the dark blue are the status Indians. Then the Métis and Inuit. So you'll see again, there are very, very big regional differences. So depending on where this study, the case study, the OECD work goes on, that the groups that will be implicated and the groups who will be interested are going to change very much according to what region you work on in, or we work in. We'll also see that, just as an aside, I've mentioned several times that identity is very complicated in Canada, and you will see that in Quebec West, so is there a pointer? Is there a beam? No.
Yes.
Wait.
Wait.
Oui.
Bouton rouge.
So, just in terms of is it on the wall? Okay, well, Quebec, no, it's okay. Quebec, the 141,000. And if you look at everything to, thank you, Vanna. If you look at everything to the east, so everything to the east, there are large wedges of green that represent Métis population. However, the Métis National Council, the national organization of Métis, does not recognize any of that population east of Quebec as being legitimately Métis. So the identity issues are very fractious even within some of the groups, certainly in the Métis National Council. There's something called the Pauli test, a Supreme Court decision about how to identify somebody as having Métis rights, which guides the registration process for Métis within their organizations, and the national organization does not recognize anybody Quebec in East. So it does have a major issue on the policy development process and the representation process. In terms of what the potential is, it is huge because the population, the indigenous population is growing at a much greater rate than the Canadian population. So there will be approximately 600,000 indigenous youth ready to enter the labor market over the next decade. So not only is this a huge potential, it's an enormous opportunity, not just for indigenous people, but for Canadians generally, for Canada as a whole, in terms of a great source of innovative, qualified and driven labor and entrepreneurs. And the other thing of note here is that many of the indigenous communities in Canada are remote, and that is generally corresponds to where natural resource development projects are or could be located. So there is definitely a correlation between indigenous communities, their traditional lands, and where natural resource project could take place. And the indigenous land base is growing, and I'll get to that in a second, through a process that we have in Canada of land claims negotiations. So that economic potential in the youth, the burgeoning youth population as a source of labor and a source of entrepreneurs and a source of innovation is big. However, there's still some significant challenges here. So you will see, this is something, the CWB you'll see up the left, is something called the Community Wellbeing Index. That is a modified human development index, United Nations process that has been modified in Canada by Indigenous Affairs to measure the well-being of Indigenous communities. So you will see that the gap in well-being between the First Nation and Inuit communities, the two bottom lines, First Nations at the bottom and then Inuit, and then Canadian communities is still large. So there's big potential, but there are some significant challenges that remain. And you won't see here, because the numbers are too small, there always have to be several graphs that nobody can read. But you'll have it in front of you. So you will see that what the last graph meant about that disparity in community well-being is very well, in some very pointed numbers on slide number 8, demonstrated or illustrated, where you see the gap between employment rates of Aboriginal or Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and median income between Indigenous and non-Indigenous is pretty significant in many areas of the country. So so you'll see at the bottom, the one in Canada, the bottom left, that the overall employment rate is almost a 10% gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and on the median income, it's 10,000, which is a significant, is a third difference. What this does not illustrate as well is that the types of employment vary significantly, that there is unfortunately a predominant employment rate in Indigenous communities, especially in the Arctic, in lower levels of organization and not within the senior ranks. And actually, I would say that is very much true for the federal government. Part of that then is related to the second graph. It's difficult to read. You will see that the I think what focus on the last two columns here, and it's important for those who are not Canadian. For many years in Canada, we referred to Aboriginal populations, and it is only a very recent change under the current government that we are now using the word Indigenous, which is used internationally. But until 2015, Aboriginal, we worked for the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. In 2015, it was changed to Indigenous, and now the current language is all Indigenous. These graphs still refer to Aboriginal from historic data. But the last two columns, you will see the high school completion, the trades completion, and the university completion, showing the Indigenous or Aboriginal population versus non is quite significant. Although there are masses of traditional skills, land-based skills, other participation in the informal economy, participation in subsistence that is not captured here. This is just about the formal Western education system. But you can see that the high school completion rates, for example, that the gap of 27%, those issues are very significant, and all then relate to ability to participate in local or regional economic development. Now, some of the things that, and this is really almost the last slide that I'm going to focus on, but some of the things that are the policy levers that the Government of Canada works on are the areas where there are very good things happening, but where the areas that are completely being rethought. The whole process of developing key partnerships and initiatives in the middle, including negotiating land claims agreements, negotiating self-government agreements, negotiating sectoral self-government agreements, where an Indigenous group may want jurisdiction just over education and not over other things. They may want jurisdiction just over health delivery. The levers are changing significantly under a very new approach to partnership development. So this is very, very much a moving target in terms of what the levers are. You'll see in the other boxes, we have significant financial programming. We have a lot of programs for economic development. We have programs, there's something later on in the presentation called the Strategic Partnership Initiatives, and you have a one-page on that. There are a lot of federal dollar value programs that can be applied to and can be used for economic development. And then on the right side of the graph, there are a lot of legislative initiatives underway to provide more options for local governance to assume responsibility without going to full self-government. Many, many changes to the Indian Act and many other legislative pieces that are being put into place to allow for greater autonomy at the community level. So the approach that is taken is sort of holistic, where in the middle there is a process of negotiating very, very long term. On the left-hand side, there are a series of programs for individuals and communities to stimulate economic development. And on the right-hand side, there are legislative changes and sort of readiness initiatives to assume greater local control. Next one, let's skip over this so we can get into the strategic partnership initiative if anybody. There is, okay, that is different actually than the one you have in front of you. So this is the one that has the paper copy is the one that has the deck one. Oh, there it is. Good. Okay. I can or just the first one. We have the. Well, I guess the point here is sorry. I didn't mean to blindside you with it.
No, it's okay.
The point of this slide is that although there's the Department of Indigenous Affairs, there are many other federal departments and agencies who have a critical role to play in Indigenous economic development, including the regional development agencies.
And to that point, I would say, sorry, to that point, I would simply mention that for us as well, the emphasis and the approach to which we're undertaking this work with Indigenous communities has changed greatly in recent years. And we now have clear commitments to increase both the funding, but also to cover a wider range of needs in terms of regional economic development in the various communities across the country. Why do you have separate agencies doing it? It's because when the Government of Canada recognizes that to undertake this kind of work, you need to build it from the communities and up, and not the other way around. So we each work with our own development actors across the territory
to select, identify the needs, identify the assets, identify the gaps, and work together towards addressing those and building the economy, not the other way around. So that's why you don't have one economic development department that will work with indigenous communities across the country, but different agencies that we're all aiming towards the same objectives. The program, the government is clear, our political masters have indicated what they wanted to achieve, and this government is very clear on doing it with indigenous communities, as Christopher mentioned, but we're gonna use and we're gonna different tools, and our approach will vary from region to region because the two maps that Christopher presented demonstrate, I think, quite eloquently that we're not at the same stage and the needs are the realities are just very different. So that's why you find these, and now these, all of those agencies working towards the same objective. ESDC will focus more on the skills and the labor market aspect of skills development and capacity development side of things, and other partners such as the BBC for the funding. To the point of the strategic partnership initiative, it's an initiative that INAC is leading, but why are we all involved? It's because for us to be able to deliver and have some impact in communities, as we also mentioned earlier, often there will be skills or capacity issues and work to be done prior for us to be able to bring the projects and to completion and to fruition. So having all of us around the table and working together via this initiative is a way that we found to work better together and to gain in flexibility in the way we do it. This initiative allows us to, sometimes when our own programs and our own institutions limit us because of the criteria and the little boxes that you need to tick to access the funding, well, this initiative gives us greater flexibility and work together to achieving with communities the goals that we have. And of course, we have our provincial partners at the table as well. So that hopefully could be a few elements of the Canadian context.
Merci, Marie-Chantal. And Marie-Chantal and her team and the OECD team have worked very hard to get almost all the regional development agencies on board for this project. So that's going to add a really interesting flavor. It's also worth noting, for those of you from other countries, if you think of the map of Canada, there are some Indigenous communities that from the census in 2011 have under 100 residents. There's the furthest north community in Canada has 153 residents in Grise Fjord in Nunavut. And then the largest Indigenous or community, First Nation community of Six Nations. Don, do you know the population of Six Nations?
17,000.
17,000. So geographically dispersed and huge variety between what are the development needs of 153 people way above the Arctic Circle to 17,000 on the outskirts of Canada's biggest city, Toronto. So it's important that the provinces, again, from a structural perspective, aligning federal efforts with provincial efforts is key. Just touching on one thing also that is a big change, every federal minister, every cabinet minister with a portfolio in their mandate letter, the letter from the Prime Minister to the cabinet minister that sets out their expectations. I think this is the first time that it mentions their responsibility to things Indigenous, and it mentions reconciliation. So it's a major demonstration of political commitment. It's worth, there's some successes. Let's see. So there are some communities, and it's going to be really interesting to see why some of these are booming. This is a list on slide 14. The Osoyoos Band in British Columbia, Member 2 on the East Coast, White Cat Dakota, Muskogean, who are doing some very, have been leaders in economic development where they're, including where we are sitting today, leaders in economic development where their communities are booming, where they have, they're generating enormous amounts of their own revenue. They are hiring people from outside of their community. They're hiring people from across the country. So there's some very, very big successes. There are many communities, 23 communities that have raised a huge amount of money through one of our pieces of legislation, the First Nation Fiscal Management Act, to work on housing and infrastructure, schools, etc. So there are a lot of very good, I don't want to paint a negative picture, there are a lot of very, very interesting and good things going on across the country. But there are still, and this will be the last slide, I'll focus on some of the persistent barriers that we have heard that have a direct link to economic development on slide 15. The access to land and resources, ownership and title is a critical one. The legal and regulatory environment. Canada is a federation with distinct constitutional responsibilities under Section 91 for the federal government and Section 92 for the provinces. First Nation reserves are federal land. There are many, many regulatory and legislative gaps on that land that would be assumed by the provinces if it was provincial land. So the legal and regulatory environment is very, very fragmented because of these chunks of federal land in the middle of provinces. Skilled labor, mentioned the labor force issue and job readiness. I had an interesting discussion with the chief. Some of us were part of that yesterday morning about their training institute here and job readiness and what is being done. And he mentioned in his opening remarks about the 23-year-old single mother without high school and how they are addressing that through their learning institute. There are skilled labor issues. Financing for businesses and communities, access to capital is a big one. If you don't own the land, you may not own the house that you live in, and you may not have collateral, but access to capital is a big one. Deficit in capacity and skilled labor, that's the same thing. And then deficit in infrastructure. For those of you who've had the chance to go to Indigenous communities in Canada, you'll see some have very, very good infrastructure, and many lack some of the basics. Clean water and effective school buildings and health clinics, etc. So there are some persistent barriers, but some very, very, very good news story. And overall, in a context of an environment of a lot of possibility for very positive change. So, Dom, if you have anything to correct or to add, I mean, I'm just a bureaucrat on all of this stuff. We live and breathe this every day from a non-federal perspective, so it's just obviously up to you whether there's anything you want to challenge or add or take away from.
Sure, I welcome the opportunity to add to that. One is that probably in the past 30 years, Supreme Court rulings have been in favor of Indigenous land claim and Indigenous rights, treaty rights. So we've been winning significant court cases since that time. And I know when I picture that there's federal lands, of course that's not the view of Indigenous people, and some of these rulings have identified Indigenous nations having self-government and authority over their lands and traditional territories. So I think just to provide that kind of clarification, there are definitely pockets of lands in Canada that are, we talked about the north as well, where it's where Indigenous governments have the authority and jurisdiction. The other thing I wanted to say is, what to me was it's my everyday work, and I know that that is the work of Aboriginal financial institutions. And on slide 14, go back one, it talks about that over the last 20 years, AFIs have leveraged $240 million of public investment into $2 billion of developmental lending for Indigenous businesses, and that is the case where we actually have better repayment rates than the conventional banks do in terms of lending on reserve are people are good risks. Although, you know, when you look at the issues of security and all that, they would probably be rated lower. But for us, as a lender to Indigenous businesses, we have great loan repayment because people feel they have ownership of the AFIs, because our AFIs are owned by our communities and collective of communities. In most cases, there's some that are owned by individual First Nation communities. And there's also Métis AFIs as well, and the Inuit. So the Inuit ones, I believe, are also community owned. That's a really important success story to highlight with the work of our own lending organizations, because a lot of us not only lend, but we do regional economic development, which is really important to this particular initiative for people to understand that. So I think it's important to note that. There's so many great success stories, and when you look at the fact that in Canada today there are 43,000 plus Indigenous businesses, most of those were financed by AFIs. And when you look at the fact that we have a lot of businesses that are owned and operated by Indigenous women, higher than probably the rate of when you look at mainstream society, I think we have higher rates of investment in Indigenous women businesses. So there's a couple of things I just wanted to add to that presentation, but thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dawn. Very, very useful. And one can't underestimate the impact of court decisions. A lot of public policy has been in reaction to a whole series of Indigenous court cases where the Indigenous claimants have won for the last 30 years. And it will continue. So the balance of power as a result of court rulings and things like unfair payments change.
So I have the job of timekeeper, unfortunately, and we have about 35 minutes left in this session. I'm sure we have a lot of questions that we'd like to ask, but for the sake of having the opportunity to have the other presenters present, I'd like to welcome now Warren. If you could give your presentation, and followed by the following is Guru. And then if we actually do run out of time, following this, we're having lunch, and I really hope we continue this discussion over lunch and have the opportunity to ask more questions over lunch.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Just a little bit of background, just so people can have an understanding as I go through this. Australia is a federation. That means that we have a sovereign federal government, but also we have 6 sovereign states. And there's a division between what people can say and do to each other. They have to work in a collaboration. And so, like, up until the 1960s, Aboriginal affairs is what we call it in Australia, was controlled by the states. The federal government only had a voice in the territories. We had a number of territories, and that was it. They couldn't tell the states how they operated. And for Aboriginal people, that depending on what state you lived in, the laws were different and how you were treated. Australia moved in the 1960s from more of a protection and segregation of Indigenous Australians to full citizenship, and also control by the federal government, the policy area. Indigenous population is 640,200, which is about 2.8% of the Australian population. The Indigenous, this is the part I like the best, the Indigenous median age is 23 years, so that's 50% are under 23, 50% are over, so we're very, very young. When you compare that to the wider population, is 38 years. So I always say, while the wider population is getting older and grumpier, we're getting younger and sexier. A federal Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs was created, and funding for Aboriginal programs such as Ad Study for Education, placements in higher education programs, creation of Aboriginal medical and legal services were set up. And that was more of a community welfare social type approach. But equality didn't give us socio-economic advancement. Equal pay led to massive unemployment in regional and rural Australia. In fact, when farmers and that were asked, agricultural pastoral companies were asked to pay us our full wages, they actually sacked us. And so that led to a drive into welfare dependency on the fringes of towns and isolated remote homelands. The results of that were early death, child mortality rates going up, incarceration rates, substance abuse, and social breakdown within these communities. And it was more of the policy-driven, was more government-down approach to Aboriginal affairs rather than community-led initiatives. I'll take your point, Dawn. Struggle for land rights, so that led to a big struggle for land rights about how do we regain the land that belonged to us prior to 1788. In that period of time, we had the Northern Territories Land Rights Act, which was brought into 1975. You had the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Act in 1983, the AP Bylands Act in the 1980s, self-management of former reserves and missions. Reserves were actually state government-controlled Aboriginal areas, and missions, of course, were controlled by the churches. And also we had a new movement started about outstation, which is called the outstation movement, where Aboriginal people started moving back onto their lands where they were driven off during the 1960s and 70s. But this raised a number of issues, which was lack of education and training, support structures, which led to mismanagement and problems within these areas. But the big game changer was in 1992, the Mabo High Court decision. The High Court is our equivalent to the Supreme Courts in the United States. It was significant change because a lot of people think of native title, this was called native title law in Australia, as an Indigenous law system. It's not. It was actually recognition by British law, therefore Australian law, recognising the end of terra nullius, which was the land was empty, to Aboriginal people actually owning the land all the time. In fact, it said the land had actually not changed. Recognising Indigenous people's attachment to land and sea, recognising our First Nations, it was the way we see ourselves, and it's interesting that the talk about Canada was the same as us. It was through the court systems that we were able to achieve these things, using British law in our favour. 80% of Northern Australia, land and sea, are in the hands of Indigenous people today. 80% of all Australia is currently in Indigenous ownership or under claim. And if the court decisions keep them going the way that they're going, that will mean that 80% of Australia will be in the hands of Indigenous people within the next 20 years. So this has led to economic development issues. Land and sea ownership, with its at first interaction with mining, energy and agricultural industry, has led to discussions of an Indigenous economy and economic development. Development of the Indigenous Australia business, a sort of development bank was set up by the federal government, and also the Indigenous Land Corporation, which was there for the purchase and the management of lands. So not only through the native title and land rights high court decisions, we were also able to buy land and purchase it as well. The federal government also set up a policy of closing the gap targets, which is closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in the areas of life expectancy, mortality rates for kids under 5 years of old, access to early childhood education, literacy, reading and writing and numeracy, year 10, 12 attainment. Year 12 is the final year of high school that then leads on to university. And also employment outcomes, closing the gap between employment between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. There is an annual event that's held in Parliament the first day of the year, which is in February when Parliament opens, where they present the Closing the Gap report to see what the statistics are telling us in this area. For the first 8 years, there was a closing of that gap in a number of areas, especially in mortality rates and so on, access to early childhood education. But then some things started going backwards, which was the reading, writing, literacy and numeracy programs, employment outcomes, and that started to worry us. So I started to put my mind around this, and when I was appointed the chair of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, I believe the missing link was economic development, because of the simple fact is that I don't know any group of people who have lifted themselves out of poverty without an economy. Since 2014, a new drive forward, which was the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, Indigenous Business Strategy. When the focus was on employment, they were looking at it from the wrong angle. They should have been looking at it from the angle of business. Because the belief is, my belief is, jobs are a result of economic stimulus. That is a commercial, profitable business which then employs people. Based on the success of the mining and energy industry, setting targets, actions, timeframes, responsibilities, and budgets, it has to be measurable. Now, it's quite interesting what the success of the mining industry has been over the last 20 years in energy industries in Australia. 60% of mining in Australia is on Indigenous lands. 100% is of any mining and energy activity in Australia is discussed under the Native Title Act. Opposition to native title and Indigenous issues as a whole was led by the mining industry when native title was set up. In fact, if you go back to the 1990s, there was some dreadful racial TV ads and newspaper commercials against native title rights for Indigenous people. 25 years later, we now find the mining and energy industry is the biggest supporters of the Indigenous native title and Indigenous affairs. $3 billion annual payments is paid to Indigenous nations, organisations and businesses. $2.2 billion in business contracts annually. There are 200,000 employees, 19% is Indigenous, that's 38,000 Indigenous people are employed in the mining industry, 12,000 of which are women. Average salaries are $2,605 per week. $40 billion in assets is held in Indigenous trust and growing from the mining industry. So in regard to the Indigenous Advancement Strategy and the Indigenous Business Strategy, the idea is to carry that over to government and private sector results as well. Government, working with Indigenous people, was to set the environment for Indigenous economic development and activity. That was investment, taxation, regulations, etc. The creation of the Indigenous procurement policy being one, which is a federal policy in regard to the federal government, where 3% of contracts are set aside. When it first kicked off, there was $6.7 million in 2015 going to Indigenous businesses. In 2017, it is over 500 million and growing further. So within a 2-year period, it's gone from 6.7 million to 500 million. It created 847 new Indigenous businesses. We're now asking state, territory, local government, private and the community sector to do the same thing, to come up with the same contractual arrangements. $200 million has been set aside in the federal budget to develop small to medium Indigenous businesses. $90 million has been set aside for the entrepreneur funds for regional and remote areas. Indigenous strategy has to be sustainable and to utilise current programs, so we're not actually inventing new programs. So and business opportunities. For example, how do we use land and sea assets to have economic outcomes for our community? The Australian government has the Northern Australia Development, where they're putting aside $5 billion for infrastructure development. We're saying that they should be also making sure that there's a large percentage of that going to Indigenous businesses and to Indigenous communities, as they own 80% of that area. Also looking at infrastructure, there's over $40 billion worth of infrastructure, rail and road being developed in Sydney at the moment, of which about 5% of that is going to Indigenous businesses. Housing, defence, agriculture, education and other programs as well. Also utilising programs like the Ranger program, which is like a stewardess program for Indigenous communities, which looks at how Indigenous people are paid to look after the environment and cultural activities on their land. We're looking at now expanding that, how they can set them up as eco and cultural tourism programs. Education programs to support the policy and the strategy is being developed as well, because when you start developing new businesses and that like that, you need people to be trained in financial management, you need engineers, you need lawyers. Even though I'm not too sure lawyers improves society, but that's my own. I can say that I'm married to a lawyer, hence my grey hair. And we need to ensure that we start targeting these areas to start developing this education program. An example is for us to be on par with the rest of the Australian community, we need 6,000 extra accountants alone. We need about 1,000 new lawyers, and we need about 5,000 new engineers. So I'm a great believer in not just doing process. So what the government is now doing is setting targets, activities around those